4:11 a.m. Washington County, Maine. November 14th, 2025. A line of black SUVs sat dark on Route 191, engines off, half a mile from a gravel turnoff that led to nothing visible from the road. Just tree line. Just frost. Just the sound of a diesel generator running somewhere in the dark. Special Agent Diane Caraway of the FBI's Boston field office pressed 2 fingers to her earpiece. The thermal imaging unit had already confirmed it. 6 heat signatures behind the east wall of the milking parlor, motionless and clustered together. They hadn't shifted position in 3 weeks of aerial and ground-based thermal observation. Analysts described them as consistent with seated or recumbent people in a confined space. Not pacing. Not moving between rooms. Just there, or not waiting, because waiting means expecting something to change. They had been there for 106 days. The FBI SWAT element, 14 agents, moved in 2 columns up the access road. Homeland Security investigations flanked right. A Royal Canadian Mounted Police liaison officer sat in the lead vehicle, observer status only, because this case had started 400 miles north of here and crossed an international border before it ever touched American soil. The RCMP officer was Sergeant Veronique Arsenault, working the Cape Breton end since February. She'd spoken to 4 of the 6 families by phone and hadn't slept more than 4 consecutive hours in the preceding 2 weeks. 2 suspects were inside. 2 dogs on a chain in the yard. One of those suspects was already moving. The operation had a name. It had a case number. It had a 48-page affidavit filed under seal in federal court in Bangor. But the thing that started it all, the thing that broke it open, was a question. A single offhand question asked by a man who read electric meters for a living and wanted nothing more than a cup of coffee on a cold October morning. His name does not appear anywhere in the indictment. He asked to keep it that way. Here is what he noticed. And here is what it cost 2 people who thought they had chosen the right place to disappear. The farmhouse outside Machias, Maine, had been on the market for 11 months by October 2025. A shuttered dairy operation. 83 acres, a main house, a hay barn, and a milking parlor. A long, low concrete building that hadn't processed milk since the previous owners sold the herd in 2023. The listing sat on a regional real estate platform, price reduced twice, 0 showings. Banks flag properties like this for maintenance assessment. Insurance companies want quarterly checks. Nobody wanted to buy it. The meter reader's name, for the purposes of this account, is Calvin. He covered 3 rural Washington County routes on a rotating schedule, driving a county vehicle, walking properties, logging consumption data on a handheld unit. He'd worked the same routes for 9 years. He knew every barn, every well pump, every seasonal cabin that drew nothing in winter and spiked in summer. He knew these properties the way a doctor knows a patient's pulse, not from study, but from seeing them month after month. An anomaly for Calvin wasn't something he calculated. It was something he felt before he finished logging the numbers. On the morning of October 9th, 2025, Calvin pulled up to the Machias Road property and logged the reading. Then he stood still. The number was wrong. Not wrong in a way that suggested equipment failure. Wrong in a way that suggested use. Heavy, consistent, sustained use. The property had drawn an average of 940 kilowatt hours per month for the 3 months before the current owners took possession in August. That was consistent with a vacant structure, minimal draw, just the meter, and maybe a sump pump. The October reading showed 2,910 kilowatt hours. Calvin stood by the meter box and looked at the milking parlor 60 feet away. The doors were shut. The windows had been covered from inside, not with blinds or curtains, but with something heavier, something applied from within that blocked every line of sight. From outside, the windows appeared as flat, dark rectangles. The main house showed no signs of occupancy, no vehicles, no lights, no mail. The mailbox at the end of the drive hadn't been opened in some time. Leaves had accumulated against its base, undisturbed. But from the parlor, if he stood still enough, he could hear a low mechanical hum. Not a heat pump. Something larger. Something running continuously with steady persistence, suggesting it had been running for weeks. He was not a law enforcement officer. He was a man who read meters. He wrote the number down and drove to the next property. 3 days later, on October 12th, he stopped for coffee at a Citgo station on Route 1. A Washington County state trooper named Garrett was doing the same thing. They didn't know each other well. Calvin mentioned it the way you mention anything small and puzzling, the kind of thing you say because you can't quite let it go. The number had been sitting in the back of his mind for 3 days. He'd replayed the image of those covered windows a dozen times without articulating to himself why they bothered him. He said it out loud, partly to let it go and partly because Garrett would either tell him it was nothing or something, and either answer was better than not knowing. A vacant dairy farm pulling triple the power of its neighbors. Heat running. A dehumidifier, he guessed, from the sound. No cars. No mail. Garrett listened. Wrote nothing down. Said, huh. He also couldn't let it go. On October 15th, Garrett ran the property address through the county assessor's database and pulled the transfer deed. The property had sold in late July 2025 to a numbered LLC registered in Delaware. That alone wasn't unusual. Rural properties changed hands through holding companies regularly. But when Garrett cross-referenced the LLC against a secondary database maintained by the Maine State Police's Financial Crimes Unit, he got a flag. The flag had originated in Nova Scotia. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police's Cape Breton detachment had been building a file since early 2025 on 2 individuals, a man and a woman, operating what appeared to be a labor recruitment and private care placement service, targeting young adults in Atlantic Canada and the northeastern United States. The service had a name, a website, letterhead. It offered placement in private household and elder care positions with American families at wages substantially above Canadian market rates. Legitimate looking. Professionally presented. The website included testimonials attributed to previous placements, photographs of smiling young professionals in domestic care settings, and a detailed application portal that collected personal information, full name, date of birth, passport number, next of kin contact details. The thoroughness of the information collection, far more extensive than any legitimate placement service would require, was part of the mechanism. By the time a recruit submitted a completed application, the suspects had everything they needed to manage, monitor, and ultimately control that person's movements. The RCMP file noted that 6 young women had gone missing between May and July of 2025, ceased contact with families, ceased appearing at known addresses. Ages ranged from 22 to 27. A Bangor florist's assistant named Renata reported missing by her mother on June 3rd. A Portland barista named Sasha, last seen in late May. A Halifax-born registered nurse named Cora, who had crossed into the United States through the Calais border crossing on July 7th, carrying paperwork for a private care placement in Downeast Maine. 3 more women from the Cape Breton region, all in their mid-20s, all recruited through the same service. All 6 had families waiting. All 6 had people who called tip lines week after week, receiving the same update, No confirmed sightings. Investigation ongoing. Renata's mother, Paulette, had raised her daughter alone after her husband passed in 2019. In early July, 3 weeks after filing a missing persons report with Bangor police, she drove to the FBI's Bangor field office in person. She sat in a waiting room for 2 hours and was eventually seen by a duty agent who took a supplemental statement and explained that adult missing persons cases, without evidence of foul play, followed a different investigative timeline. Paulette drove home to Brewer. She continued calling the tip line every Tuesday. She kept a notebook of the names of every person she'd spoken to, their badge numbers, and the exact language they'd used. The notebook had 41 entries by the night of the raid. Sasha had been a regular at a coffee shop on Congress Street in Portland, where she'd worked since 2023. Her co-workers described her as someone who read thick novels on her breaks and sent long text messages. The last text message from her friend, sent on May 27th, said only that she was heading to an orientation for a new position and would be in touch when she got settled. She wasn't. Her friend, Joelle, filed a missing persons report with Portland police on June 9th after 12 days of unanswered messages. Joelle continued sending texts to Sasha's number for 4 months. Not one was delivered. The phone had gone dark within 48 hours of that last message. Cora's parents in Halifax had been in contact with the RCMP since the second week of July, when she failed to make a scheduled video call with her mother. She had been meticulous about those calls, every Sunday at 6 p.m., without exception, for 3 years since finishing nursing school. She had called her mother from a rest stop in New Brunswick on July 7th to say she was close to the border and the placement looked legitimate. That call lasted 4 minutes. It was the last confirmed contact anyone had with Cora. The RCMP traced the cell signal to a tower covering Route 1 in northern Maine. The signal then vanished. By October of 2025, the RCMP had enough to seek a ban, a formal community safety order, preventing the 2 suspects from returning to the Cape Breton community. That order had been granted in early October. The suspects' names were circulated to partner agencies, including U.S. Homeland Security investigations, through standard liaison channels. The flag on the Delaware LLC matched one of those names. Specifically, the signing officer on the Articles of Incorporation. Garrett forwarded the hit to the Maine State Police. Maine State Police forwarded it to the FBI's Boston field office. Boston assigned it to a joint task force with HSI that had been working cross-border labor exploitation cases since 2023. 1 power meter reading. 1 conversation at a gas station. 48 hours to connect it to a flagged name on an international watch list. The task force moved carefully. Before surveillance formally began, the task force spent 4 days on what the affidavit describes as preliminary intelligence consolidation. That meant pulling every available data thread connected to both suspects and weaving them into a coherent operational picture. Financial records tied to the Delaware LLC showed 3 months of purchases, food, utility supplies, medical items sourced from a cash-and-carry wholesaler in Calais, totaling roughly $11,000. The purchases had been made every 4 to 5 days, always in cash, always by a single buyer, matching the female suspect's description. Surveillance footage from the wholesaler, obtained through a subpoena, showed a woman in a gray fleece jacket purchasing cases of bottled water, bulk dry goods, first aid supplies, and, on 2 occasions, packages of over-the-counter antibiotics and wound dressings. She paid in cash and exited quickly, speaking only the minimum required. The medical purchases deserve attention. The task force medical consultant reviewed the purchase manifest and noted that the quantities of wound care supplies were inconsistent with a two-person household, but consistent with 6 to 8 individuals over a sustained period. The antibiotic purchases, 2 separate brands, purchased 2 weeks apart, suggested a response to infection rather than prophylactic stocking. Whatever conditions existed inside the milking parlor, the suspects had been managing health issues among those they held. Managing, not resolving. That distinction matters. I spent time going over the affidavit's surveillance log, and one passage kept drawing my attention. The agents assigned to the Macias property did not approach it directly for the first 2 weeks. They parked on a logging access road 3/4 of a mile east and ran long lens observation. They were watching for delivery patterns, utility visits, any indication of who was supplying the property and on what schedule. What they found was a tight, disciplined operation. A dark-colored pickup truck arrived every 4 days. It came from Route 1, stopped for approximately 20 minutes, and departed. Always the same vehicle. Always the same interval. Always the same driver. The discipline of it, the clockwork regularity, was itself a data point. Legitimate occupants don't operate on a 4-day resupply cycle as though they've calculated their exposure to the road. That regularity indicated planning. It indicated that someone had thought through the logistics of maintaining this location, with minimum observable contact with the outside world. On its 3rd observed arrival, agents ran the plate. The registration came back to a woman whose name matched the 2nd individual in the RCMP file. She had crossed from New Brunswick into Maine at the Halton port of entry in early August 2025, presenting a tourist visa. She had not departed. The affidavit would later note that she had been inside the United States without authorization for approximately 10 weeks before agents confirmed her identity. During that 10-week window, the task force reconstructed portions of her movements through toll records, fuel purchase receipts, and cell tower ping data obtained under a federal court order. The data showed a pattern of movement that rarely deviated from a corridor between the Macias property and the Calais wholesale supplier. She didn't visit restaurants. She didn't check into motels. She didn't appear on camera at any location beyond the supply runs. Whatever she was doing it close to that property with a deliberateness that bordered on obsessive. The task force requested emergency authorization for electronic surveillance. A federal magistrate in Bangor signed the order on October 29, 2025. Within 72 hours, agents had established signal intercept capability, covering 2 cell numbers associated with the suspects. Most communication was in a mixture of English and one of the maritime regional dialects of French. The task force brought in a bilingual analyst from the HSI Montreal liaison office. Working out of a temporary command post in a rented commercial space in Macias, the analyst reviewed intercept traffic in near real time and flagged communications of significance within hours of capture. The work was technically demanding and, by the analyst's own description, emotionally punishing. The intercepts were clinical. The 2 suspects spoke about the 6 women in operational terms, as a resource to maintain, a liability to manage. There was no affect in the communications, no acknowledgement of the humanity of the people they were holding. The analyst noted that this flatness was, in some ways, more disturbing than anger or cruelty would have been. What the intercepts revealed over the following 10 days was a structure that had been running longer than anyone estimated. The property outside Macias was not the origin. It was a way station, a holding location established after an earlier location, somewhere in northern New Brunswick, became operationally untenable for reasons the intercepts didn't make clear. References to the earlier location were oblique and guarded. The suspects called it the first house, and the conversation carried a quality of suppressed anxiety. Something had happened there. Something had accelerated their departure. Whether that was a near discovery, a confrontation, a failure of the physical infrastructure, or something else, the intercepts didn't say. The suspects had moved the operation south across the border in late July. They had chosen Maine specifically because the original RCMP investigation had been concentrated in Atlantic Canada. Maine was outside the blast radius. That was their critical miscalculation. This is the part that doesn't sit easily. This operation had been running for months. 6 women had been behind that milking parlor door since late July, some of them for the full 106 days before the raid. The families had been calling. The tip lines had been receiving. The RCMP had a file, and none of it had connected to a shuttered dairy farm in Washington County, Maine, until a meter reader mentioned a number that was 3 times higher than it should have been. What this case shows about cross-border operations is that the geography itself is a vulnerability. Suspects move across jurisdictions, specifically because law enforcement doesn't. The RCMP had the names. HSI had the watch list. The state police had the flag. But none of those systems spoke to each other fast enough to find 6 missing women before a county utility worker noticed something that shouldn't have been running. By November 5th, the task force had enough for a warrant. The federal prosecutor's office in Bangor reviewed the package and filed under seal the following morning. But the actual breach was delayed, not by legal process, but by weather. A nor'easter tracking up the Maine coast was projected to hit Washington County on November 8th. The task force operations coordinator made the call to hold. Moving a SWAT element up an unlit gravel access road in 40-mile-per-hour wind and horizontal sleet against 2 suspects who had already demonstrated operational discipline introduced unacceptable risk. Not just to the agents. To the 6 women behind the parlor door. They waited 6 days. Put yourself in the position of the agents running surveillance during those 6 days. You have a sealed warrant. You have a thermal image showing 6 heat signatures that haven't moved more than a few feet from the east wall in 3 weeks of observation. You know who is inside. You know roughly what the conditions are. And you're sitting in a vehicle on a logging road watching a storm come in, because the call has been made to hold. The surveillance team during those 6 days was operating under conditions that the after-action report describes, with careful bureaucratic understatement, as operationally demanding. The nor'easter that came through on November 8th dropped 14 inches of snow on Washington County and pushed wind gusts to 53 miles per hour. The logging road that had served as the primary observation post became impassable. The team shifted to a secondary position, a disused equipment shed on an adjacent property, accessed through snowshoes and a half-mile walk in blackout conditions, that provided a narrower but still viable line of sight to the parlor. The generator hum continued through the storm. The thermal signatures didn't change. The supply truck didn't come. Its 4-day cycle would have put it at the property on November 9th, and it arrived on schedule 1 day after the worst of the storm cleared, navigating the newly plowed Route 1, and then the still partly drifted access road, with a deliberateness the surveilling agent described as suggesting either local familiarity or advanced reconnaissance of road conditions. Neither interpretation was reassuring. The warrant sat sealed. The truck arrived on November 9th. It departed. The hum of the generator continued. There's a particular quality to waiting that you can't fully account for in an after-action report. The agents in that shed knew what was behind the wall they were watching. They had read the RCMP file. They had reviewed the recruitment materials. They had listened to the intercepts. Sergeant Arsenault, who rotated through the observation position twice during the 6-day hold, later said in her debrief that the hardest part was the generator. It ran continuously. It never faltered, which meant the people keeping it running were being meticulous. And meticulous, in this context, meant that they had a plan for what happened if something changed, a plan that the agents behind the tree line were not privy to and couldn't fully anticipate. The storm cleared on November 12th. The task force confirmed conditions on the 13th. Final operational brief at 11 p.m. Breach set for 4:11 a.m., November 14th. The tactical plan called for simultaneous entry at 2 points: the main access door on the north face of the milking parlor and a secondary equipment bay door on the south. FBI SWAT would take the north. HSI Tactical would take the south. 2 K9 units were assigned for the property perimeter specifically because the surveillance log had identified dogs on a chain in the yard. The K9 handlers had been briefed to neutralize the animals non-lethally. Tactical priority was speed and containment, not escalation. The dogs, both large mixed-breed animals observed from the surveillance position, were estimated to have a bark radius that would alert the interior within 3 to 4 seconds of stimulation. The K9 assignment was therefore the first and most time-sensitive element of the breach sequence. If the dogs weren't contained before the entry teams reached the parlor doors, the advantage of surprise was gone. One obstacle worth noting here: the property's floor plan obtained from county assessor records showed the milking parlor interior as a single open space, standard dairy configuration, a long central aisle flanked by stanchion rows. What it didn't show was a modification the suspects had made after taking possession. A section of the interior, approximately the eastern third of the building, had been physically divided off by a partition constructed from the parlor's original equipment: stall dividers, corrugated panels, and what appeared from the intercepts to be sections of the hay barn's interior wall. The thermal imaging had shown the 6 heat signatures clustered behind this improvised partition. The agents going in through the north door didn't know the exact configuration of that interior wall. They knew it existed. They didn't know precisely where the door was. They had 20 seconds at most before noise and light compromise would require them to move regardless. The breach began at 4:11 a.m. exactly. The 2 K9 units cleared the yard in the first 18 seconds. Both dogs were contained non-lethally. The north face entry team breached the main door on a ram strike and moved into the parlor interior. The cold hit them as they entered. The parlor was heated, but only minimally, the generator running 2 electric space heaters visible on the thermal imaging, and the exterior temperature was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The contrast between the frozen yard and the interior was noticeable but not dramatic. What was dramatic was the smell. The after-action report describes it in 2 words: confined occupancy. Anyone who has done this work understands what that means. The South Bay door came open simultaneously, hydraulic breach, and the HSI element entered from the opposite end. The male suspect was located in the mudroom, connecting the main house to the parlor. He was prone on the floor and in custody within 30 seconds of initial breach. He had apparently been asleep on a folding cot in the mudroom, a detail agents noted as consistent with a security posture, someone positioned between the main house and parlor as a matter of operational practice. He didn't resist. He said nothing. He was flex-cuffed and moved to the exterior within 45 seconds of initial entry. No weapon was discharged. The female suspect was not in the mudroom. She was not in the parlor interior. Thermal imaging, real-time, had her moving fast across the open ground behind the main house toward the tree line, approximately 90 yards north. She had apparently been awake before the breach, the K9 team's movement into the yard, despite the noise discipline the handlers had maintained, had been enough. She had exited through a back window of the main house and was already at a dead sprint across the snow-covered field when the entry teams came through the parlor doors. One of the K9 units was redirected. The pursuit lasted 90 seconds. The snow in the field was 8 inches deep, which reduced her speed significantly. She was taken to the ground at the edge of the tree line and was in custody by 4:13 a.m. She had made it to within 30 feet of the wood line. In the after-action, the K9 handler noted that another 15 seconds, if the dog had been deployed from a slightly different position, or if she had made the tree line, the pursuit would have moved into dense mixed forest in complete darkness. It was close. The secondary element, now inside the parlor, located the improvised partition. The door, a repurposed stall gate with a slide bolt on the outside, was on the south-facing wall of the partition, approximately 11 feet from the equipment bay entrance. The bolt was thrown from outside. The HSI agent on point slid it open. Behind the door, 6 women. They were seated or lying on pallets along the east wall, arranged in the configuration the thermal imaging had shown for weeks. The space was lit by a single work light connected to the generator circuit. It was approximately 18 feet wide and 30 feet long. The ceiling was the original parlor ceiling, corrugated metal at roughly 9 feet. The temperature in the space was warmer than the parlor exterior, but not by much. The women were dressed in layers, what appeared to be a combination of their own clothing and items that had been provided to them. They were awake. They had heard the breach. Several of them were standing when the door opened. Clinical exam was initiated on scene by the FBI's embedded medical officer within 4 minutes of breach. All 6 were transported by ambulance convoy to Eastern Maine Medical Center in Bangor before 5 a.m. Each had been held in that space for varying lengths of time, the shortest, 103 days. The longest, 106. The paramedic units that transported the women filed individual patient care reports. Those reports are sealed. What has been noted in the public record, in a single line of the FBI's press statement, is that all 6 were ambulatory and conscious at time of rescue. Beyond that, the medical details belong to the women themselves. What is known, because it appears in the affidavit's evidence manifest, is what the medical officer found on initial assessment that warranted the ambulance transports rather than a more gradual evacuation. The specifics are not public. The decision to transport all 6 by ambulance rather than by standard vehicle speaks for itself. The strangest detail in the case file appears in a single line of the affidavit's attachment schedule. Among the items seized from the main house was a spiral-bound notebook. Inside, in neat handwriting, was a log. Daily entries. Dates. Initials. Numbers. The task force analyst described it, in bureaucratic language, as a records maintenance document. What it recorded, the specifics, doesn't appear anywhere in the public filing. The nature of what those 6 women endured during those 106 days is not described in the indictment. It doesn't need to be. The court record states that all 6 received immediate and ongoing medical evaluation, consistent with the conditions of their confinement. That single line, in federal legal language, carries everything it needs to. The day after the raid, the task force executed a secondary search of the main house and the hay barn under an expanded warrant. In the hay barn, agents found a locked steel storage cabinet bolted to the interior wall framing. Inside were 6 passports, 6 cell phones, and 6 sets of identification documents, the passports and phones belonging to the 6 women held in the parlor. The phones had been powered off and stored. The passports had been taken at recruitment, consistent with a pattern documented in virtually every forced labor and trafficking case the task force had previously worked. Without documents, without communication, without any connection to the outside world, the mechanism of control was nearly complete. Nearly, because the women had found ways to maintain something, a collective record of time, a shared accounting of the days. The investigators found evidence of this on the interior wall of the partition space, where a series of small marks had been scratched into the concrete block, using what appeared to be a piece of metal from a broken stall fitting. The marks were grouped in sets of 7. 15 complete groups. 1 partial group of 1. 106 days, counted from the inside. Federal prosecutors in the District of Maine filed charges the afternoon of November 14th. The male suspect, a 41-year-old man whose last known address had been in Inverness County, Cape Breton, was charged with conspiracy to commit forced labor, transportation for forced labor across state lines, and unlawful harboring of persons in furtherance of labor trafficking. The female suspect, a 38-year-old with dual Canadian-American residency documentation, faced the same counts plus 1 additional count related to her continued presence in the United States in violation of immigration conditions. Both were held without bail. The federal magistrate's detention order cited flight risk and the cross-border nature of the operation. Defense counsel for the male suspect filed a motion challenging jurisdiction on the grounds that his client was a Canadian national whose alleged conduct had originated in Canada. That motion was denied within 72 hours. The question of jurisdiction in cross-border labor trafficking cases had been litigated extensively in federal courts over the preceding decade, and the precedent was unambiguous. The location of the harm determined the venue. Both suspects were transferred to the Cumberland County Correctional Center in Portland, where they were held in separate units with no communication access pending arraignment. They were arraigned on November 18th. Both entered not guilty pleas. Neither spoke beyond the minimum required for the arraignment record. The RCMP issued a brief statement acknowledging cooperation with American federal authorities in connection with an ongoing investigation. The Cape Breton Community Safety Order, which had barred both individuals from returning to the community, remained in effect. Renata's mother was reached by an FBI Victim Services Coordinator at 6:47 a.m. on November 14th. She had been calling the tip line for 5 months and 11 days. The Victim Services Coordinator who made the call, a woman named Denise with 12 years in the role, later described the conversation in a team debrief. Paulette didn't cry immediately. She asked, in a very steady voice, whether her daughter was alive. She asked whether she was hurt. She asked whether she could come to Bangor. Denise told her yes to all 3 in that order. Then Paulette was quiet for a long moment, and then she said thank you, in a way that Denise said she would never forget. Sasha's family in Portland was notified at 7:12 a.m. Joelle, her closest friend, was notified through the Portland Police Department's liaison with the FBI Victim Services Unit. She had sent Sasha 143 text messages over 4 months to a phone that had been powered off and locked in a steel cabinet in a hay barn. When a Portland detective called to tell her that Sasha had been found alive, Joelle was on her way to work. She sat down on the sidewalk in the November cold and didn't get up for some time. Cora's parents in Halifax were notified through RCMP liaison. Sergeant Arsenault made the call personally. She had spoken to Cora's mother 3 times during the investigation, always with the same careful framing, that the investigation was progressing, that they hadn't lost hope, that the family would be among the first to know. On November 14th, she called and said, "We found her." The families had been waiting. Now they had an answer. And the answer was hard in its own way, because it confirmed what they had feared, while also confirming that the waiting was over. The meter reader, Calvin, was not in the operations center that night. He was not notified until a week later, through an informal call from Trooper Garrett, who felt he deserved to know it had worked. Calvin reportedly said very little. He had a meter route to finish. He went back to it. Here is what needs to be said. The system worked in this case, but it worked by accident. A county utility worker is not a law enforcement resource. His observation wasn't the result of a tip line, a community outreach program, a neighborhood watch, or any coordinated reporting mechanism. It was a conversation at a gas station. If Garrett had been getting coffee 2 minutes earlier or later, the observation goes nowhere. 6 women stay in that building. The question worth sitting with, and it doesn't have a clean answer, is how many identical power readings have been logged on identical rural properties by identical meter readers who didn't happen to be standing next to someone who knew what to do with the information. 2 prosecutions are proceeding through federal court in Bangor as of the date of this account. A trial date has not been set. Both suspects have entered not guilty pleas through appointed counsel. The Delaware LLC that held the property has been dissolved. The farm has been placed under a federal asset recovery order and removed from the real estate listing. 6 women are no longer behind that door. But the investigation into the full scope of the operation, the northern New Brunswick location, the earlier activity that made that location untenable, the total number of individuals recruited through the placement service, remains open. The RCMP and HSI task force have identified at least 3 additional names in the suspect network who have not been charged. Their locations are, as of this account, unknown. A federal grand jury in Bangor is reviewing evidence related to those 3 additional individuals. The grand jury process is sealed. What is known is that the intercept material gathered during the 30-day surveillance window preceding the raid captured communications that referenced a broader network, references to other placements, other locations, other recruits who had moved through the system before the 6 women in the Makia's parlor. Those references are oblique and contested. Defense counsel will argue they are ambiguous. The prosecution will argue they are a map. The recruitment website that brought Cora across the border in July is offline. A cached version remains accessible through Internet Archive services. As of November 2025, the contact email on that site was still receiving messages. The FBI's cyber division has been monitoring the inbox. The messages that continue to arrive are from young people in Atlantic Canada and the northeastern United States, asking about placement opportunities. They describe themselves in careful, hopeful language. They list their qualifications. They ask about wages and start dates. The cyber division does not respond to these messages. They document them, because each one is a data point about the reach of the original recruitment apparatus and the degree to which it continues to function, at least in the perception of people who haven't heard about the arrests. 6 women recovered. 3 suspects still unlocated. A notebook that tells a story the indictment doesn't. We read them. The milking parlor still stands on the Machias Road property. The generator has been removed. The improvised partition remains in place, cataloged as evidence, photographed and sealed. The stall gate door that served as the entrance to the space where 6 women spent 106 days is closed, its slide bolt secured from the outside, the way it was secured every night for 3.5 months. Except now, it is secured by an evidence seal, rather than by the deliberate hand of someone who wanted it to stay shut. In the silence of that building now, on a property that went 11 months without a single showing, there is nothing to hear. The marks on the wall are still there. 15 complete groups of 7. 1 partial group of 1. The investigators photographed them. The photographs are in the evidence file, The concrete block won't be moved. It is a load-bearing section of the exterior wall, and dismantling it would require a demolition permit. So the marks will remain in that building for as long as the building stands. 106 days, scratched into the wall by the people who lived them. The case is not closed. The network is partially dismantled. The mechanism that funded it, the demand that sustained it across 2 countries and across 106 days, has not been charged, has not been named, and hasn't been resolved. The meter reader asked one question. The answer is still being